What is going on, my fellow makers? Welcome to Keep Making, not Mad, and I want to share with you how I built these scattered terrain city ruins. Now let's get to it.
Shall we begin?
So just before we get into it, I want to share with you this Weathertop piece I did a couple weeks ago. I need some companion pieces to go with this guy to run a full encounter with it, and so this is the look we're going to be going for. So starting off with the print we're using, I think these are the Stormguard runes, and I'll include a link in the description below. And I'm also using some Ulvheim runes and some runes from the Printing Goes Ever On. So once I get them off the print bed, I'm just sanding the bottoms and the top of the connection pieces so that I can apply the super glue and they'll adhere well. Now, what I like to do is I also do a lot of SLA printing, and so when those fail, as they are want to do if you're as bad as I am at placing supports, you want to hang on to those. You can use them and break them into pieces to use them as like statues and stuff like that. Super handy. So I'm going to take everything out after I poster tack it down to the Lazy Susan there. Then I'm going to use a gray primer and then just a Rust-Oleum white from over top of that gray primer. That gives us a really cool zenithal highlight and gives us some natural highlights and shadowed areas, so that when we apply our base coats, we sort of get that natural effect going, as if the sun was, directly above or whatever angle you're spraying that white can from. So it's a really cool effect you can do pretty easily with those two cans. So we'll move on to the base. It's styrofoam. This is a Woodland Scenic rock mold. This is casting plaster just laid out on flat sheet, broken up into several pieces. This is cardstock that I'm using as the main base, and then we need hot glue, and some DAS modeling clay, and a pavement texture roller. This one's from Green Stuff World. I also do a lot of 3D printed ones. I'll include some links below and some collections that you can use. So I'm just putting my styrofoam piece out on the board, cutting that board out, marking it out with a pencil, and then cutting it out with an X-Acto knife. Once I got the approximate measurements, I'm just doing some rough lines with the Sharpie and the pencil, cutting everything to size, making sure my piece fits on there, and then I'm going to hot glue everything to the base. I want to make sure those edges are beveled on the base piece, and then I'm placing this styrofoam. If you want it to be playable, make sure you're placing it flat. I didn't really need that, so I just placed it, however I wanted. And I'm placing this in to act as a base for the rubble we'll be placing later. I get that DAS modeling clay and I'm rolling it out over top of the piece. I do this a little bit differently later on, as you'll see, but here I'm just rolling it over the piece, and then I'm going to take that texture roller and roll it on. You see, the mistake I made there is I didn't cut out the areas where the printed piece will attach to the styrofoam. You're going to want to do that, and you'll see me do that later on. So now I'm placing those Woodland Scenics casted rocks. Again, that's just casting plaster into that rock mold, and you can see I'm starting to place a little bit of the rubble here. This was like the test piece. So I'll get in sort of more to how I did that a little bit later on, but this step I'm just placing the rocks around it so we can build up that sort of plateau. And yeah, so this is the statue piece, and so this is Goonies doubloon coin. I printed another one that looked better, so this one got scrapped, but this will serve as a nice sort of base ground texture for the statue, sort of like a display piece. And that's a statue of David that I think I dropped it or something happened. It didn't look good. So you can see here, this is where I'm doing the DAS modeling clay a little bit differently. I'm rolling it out beforehand, and then I'm going to cut it to shape, roll it over with the texture roller, and then I'll sort of peel it off of here and place it on after. It just depends what you're doing. Sometimes I find this method more applicable than the other. I guess it'll just be personal preference. You can see here I'm marking out where the feet will attach to the base, and I'm actually taking those off. That way I can super glue this piece, not having to glue it to the DAS modeling clay, and that'll give a way better adhesion from the printed piece. So those stairs are the ones actually from the Printing Goes Ever On, and I'll include a link below. Again, I'm applying rocks around the perimeter of these plateaus. And then to seal in the rocks, so hot glue is not the best way to attach those rocks to your base. So what I do for these rocks is I'll go in with Sculptamold after to really secure them to the base. And also we'll use the Sculptamold over all of that styrofoam that we placed. That'll give a good, ground base for our rubble to go in afterwards. Don't have access to Sculptamold, it is hard to find sometimes. You can go to Geek Gaming Scenics. I think they ship worldwide now, and you can get their Modeled compound, which is apparently better. I can't tell you because I haven't tried it yet, but hopefully soon. If you're in Canada, go to Michael's, get something called Fast Mash. Go to Home Depot, mix it with DAP Plaster of Paris, and you'll get the same thing. Or if you don't have those options, you can use any sort of drywall compound. You won't be able to work it as much, but it will work for your ground formations. Bear with me over these next shots. They were shot in portrait mode and I didn't realize till it was too late, so it is what it is. I'm using PVA glue, some watered down PVA glue, some isopropyl alcohol, and some water to put the rubble onto the base. So basically all you're doing is laying down that PVA, putting the bigger pieces, then you're going to spray it all down with isopropyl and water, and then we put over the watered PVA glue. That'll help bond all of these smaller pieces of rubble to each other. It soaks in, it's a very porous material, the casting plaster, and then we want to crush up some of that and pour it on over top, so we're really getting that simulated crushed stone, crushed building, rubble sort of effect. And again, you're going to go over that with the watered down PVA and isopropyl alcohol. So once we're done applying the rubble, we need to do our ground texture. So this will be like, our dirt, our simulated soil sort of textures. We're going to be using tile grout and PVA glue as well as isopropyl alcohol. And again, that sealant glue, that watered down PVA. So just PVA straight to the base. Then we're sprinkling our tile grout over top, spraying it down with isopropyl alcohol, and then sealing it all in with that watered down PVA. Now you don't need to use tile grout. I use it because it's going to dry extremely hard and you won't be worried about your pieces breaking. It's also the best for scale when you're dealing with war games and heroic scale stuff. But things like sand and baking powder, I've heard people use cat litter, all that kind of stuff, anything that'll simulate grit. Feel free to experiment with. Once it's all done, I seal it all in with some more watered down PVA, including the rubble and the ground texture. So this is the rock look I'm going for when we begin to paint them. This is a rock look I've achieved, and this is what happened. As you can see, that is not what we're going for. And I achieved that, if you want to call it achieve, with these acrylic inks, and oh my god, just look at it. So obviously this wasn't going to do. You can see I'm pretty frustrated with it, so we're going to have to readjust. That's what I used on the Weathertop piece, and it turned out, you can see here, my lonely Weathertop piece, I had to proceed because I couldn't leave this piece alone. And so this is what we sort of ended up with. So these are, instead of acrylic inks, these are just watered down paints, which I recommend you using. One of these is actually a even further watered down wash. And so I'm doing the leopard spotting technique. This is where you sort of get the colors as you see there, apply them into the porous material so the rock will take that all in, and then you go over with a black wash and apply that. So you can already see as this rock texture sort of comes together here. And then once we're done with the black wash, we're going to go over with a dry brush to get the sort of edges of the rock. So once it all comes together, it'll sort of make more sense, but this is what I opted to after I had royally screwed that up. That's why you always have to have a test piece. I didn't. I thought the Weathertop piece was my test piece, and so I just jumped straight into it, and for whatever reason, it just did not turn out the same. So, this is sort of what you get. If you want something more realistic, you'd sort of tone down the colors. But to correct the mistake that I had made with the acrylic inks from the beginning, I'm just spraying the rubble over with, this Gull Gray from Vallejo. I leave the rocks, and I just treat that by going over and over with the black wash and the dry brush. That seemed to work for me. The rocks didn't come out, as good as they did on the Weathertop piece, but for the ruins and for the rubble, I just opted to a gray, and then I hit that with a black wash, and then we're doing that same dry brush over all the ruins and the rubble as well. So if you're unfamiliar with the dry brushing technique, it's really simple. Literally, you're taking a dry brush, so you're not dipping it in the water or anything. You're getting paint on that brush. You're taking most of the paint off onto like a towelette or like a napkin, whatever, paper towel, and then you're going over top of the highest edges of your piece. You want to use a flat brush for this, and it's going to pick out those highest edges, and you'll get a lot of detail and depth from that. So you'll see me do that with this warm tan later on, as well as this ivory color. So we're just picking out those highest points, and we get a lot of dimensionality from the rocks that way. once we've hit the rocks and the rubble with the dry brush, we'll be moving on to our ground texture. I just hit my ground texture with this burnt umber. I do this on like most of my pieces, so it's like a uniform, soiled kind of color. But what I usually do, it's not on camera here, is I hit it with a black wash afterwards, and then I go in with like a lighter brown and give it some more volume. Same way we would with the rocks, but because it's a finer texture, you get sort of more definition from it. And once that's done, we're going to be adding all our greenery. So I start with the sort of bigger stuff. Now, depending on how you want to do this, it all depends on the look you're going for. So if you're looking for like a more realistic look, or like a scale modeling approach, you'll want to put, the things that are getting more moisture, those will be your darker colors. And where things are sort of more dry, more sun-kissed, if you will, those will be your lighter colors for your foam flocks, right? But if you're going for like a lighting effect, maybe you want to put all the darker foams you have in the recesses and the shaded areas. So it just depends on what you're going for. I'm sort of going, because this will be seen 360, it's a war gaming piece. I'm sort of, trying to simulate reality. That seems like a stretch for the way these come out. They're, cartoony. They're for D&D, right? But, that's sort of the approach I'm taking. So in the sort of lower areas, that's where the green's going to go. And, at some point in every process when I'm doing foam flocks, I sort of just forget everything I just said and just apply where it looks cool. So that should be your, priority. Make something that looks cool that you'll be proud of. And so after that, I go in with the sort of the finer. So this will be like you're simulating grass here with these finer flocks. And so sometimes I go over the bigger pieces I just did after I soak them in with the watered down PVA. That gives them a highlight. It sort of simulates, if that was a bush, the bigger pieces were bushes. These are sort of the flowers or plants coming off of those bushes. And then, like everything else, you want to spray it down with isopropyl alcohol and soak it with the watered down PVA. And here we're moving on to the vines and sort of overgrowth. And so what we do is we mix in, I call this the unholy guacamole, trademark it, baby, let's go. But basically what I'm doing here is I'm putting fine and coarse flock, mixing that in with just a ton of PVA, mixing it together so we get sort of like a paste. And then I'm applying that straight to like the vertical areas. And sort of making it look like vines have overgrown over these, ancient ruins. So you can see that here. Now, do keep in mind, because the PVA is white, this is always going to dry darker than it looks when you're applying it. So try to keep that in mind if you're going for that lighting effect I was talking about earlier. This is not how it'll look in the end, and you can apply that same logic to your foam flocks. And once it was all done, here's how it turned out.
Shall we begin?
Well, that'll do it for this episode. Thank you so much for checking out the video, and if you liked it, make sure you're hitting the thumbs up button. If you want to see my new videos when they come out, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, hitting that bell so you're notified when they do release. Whether you're doing everything perfect from the get-go or making mistakes along the way like I am, keep making it.